The drugs that people generally die from are things like fentanyl, opioids, etc. They're not party drugs. They're not drugs you take to go out and have a good time, right? They're drugs that you take to retreat and withdrawal. And interestingly, one of the main reasons why those drugs do end up or often killing people is because if there is a bad reaction, then there's no one with you. And so a big predictor of dying from drugs is being alone.
Richard, where does this podcast find you?
I'm home in East Tennessee, Southern Appalachia, but I've been on the road. I've been in Hong Kong and then been in Oregon. I had this amazing trip out to this community college in Oregon where they're just cratering male share of employment. They're dealing with it. They're acting on it. And this guy told me he's been visiting all these rural high schools in Oregon to find out why the boys are not applying to college anymore. And there's a bunch of reasons. He said the most common thing he heard was, I'm afraid that I'll be lonely, that I kind of won't belong, I won't have friends.
Really?
It's really struck me. Yeah.
That's wild. I mean, I know that generally speaking, young men have a tendency to stay on the farm and women have a tendency to take off for the city. But I had never heard that about that being a reason for why young men weren't applying to college.
Same. I mean, we know they are more lonely. We've talked about this before, like the loneliness epidemic is hitting young men a bit more. And a number of college campuses have told me that when they do their kind of belonging surveys, they very often find it is men, especially those from kind of more rural areas, who will say that they just don't really feel like they belong on the campus, right? They don't have the right habits, the right language, the right sensibilities or whatever. And I really worry about that because you start to feel like college is not for working class guys, especially from rural areas, then you're losing a heck of a lot of potential talent.
Yeah, I've always been a big advocate, and it's not as toxic to people now as it was, but I've always been a huge advocate for joining a fraternity or a sorority when you get to school. And there's some credible stats. You become twice as likely to complete your 4-year education when you join a fraternity or a similar organization that kind of distills it down to a smaller community, if you will. But anyways, the reason we wanted to bring you on is you just put out a paper on unnatural male deaths, including injury, suicide, and drug overdose. Why is this happening?
Yeah, so we're really motivated by our previous work on suicide, where there's a well-known big gap, especially now among young men, more likely to take their lives from suicide. But CDC actually captures this really good data on unnatural deaths, so kind of injuries is the language they sometimes use. And we really hadn't seen anyone break that down by gender. And so we did break it down by gender, and a number of things jumped out to me. The thing I wasn't prepared for was just the scale of the increase in injury deaths. So it's up by 57% since 2001. It's 200,000 men a year who are dying from one of these, quotes, non-natural causes. The biggest one is drug poisonings, followed by suicide, followed by motor vehicle crashes, followed by homicide, and then the other ones. And it's 2.5 times higher among men than among women. And that increase is so big and largely driven by this drug epidemic that we're seeing. The thing that really blew me away is if you look at the deaths, you're always going to see deaths from non-natural causes, the ones we've seen above, right? The question is, are they going down or up? And they're going up in a way that's extraordinary. So just to kind of put a sharp data point on this, if the death rate from these unnatural causes had remained the same since 2001, right, so it'd been a flat line since then we would have lost 400,000 fewer men in those couple of decades. And that's about the number of men we lost in World War II.
That's a fascinating stat. The question I would have is that, okay, the leading cause here appears to be drug poisonings. Is that fentanyl? And also, is this rooted in loneliness and depression and why men are turning to drugs, or because drugs are more available, because they're more accepted in culture? Give us some of the nuance here.
Yeah, the way this has been framed a lot, you've talked about this yourself, but this idea of deaths of despair. And as I say, the rates are highest among middle-aged men between 30 and mid-50s. And it's been associated for a long time with kind of declining economic prospects, community breakdown, loss of affiliation to family, religion, etc. And so if you like, that's the kind of demand side. But there's also clearly a supply side issue here too, which is the way in which these drugs, fentanyl and others, have just been flooded into some of these communities on the supply side is clearly part of the story too. And so there's actually a big debate now among social scientists whether this term deaths of despair is actually helpful or not, because what that does is it kind of points to the individuals themselves, to the communities, and says it's all demand driven, right? But actually it's supply side as well. And we have to take both into account, I think. But you're right, there's clearly a despair element to it. One of the things I find interesting about this is that the drugs that people generally die from are things like fentanyl, opioids, etc. They're not party drugs. They're not drugs you take to go out and have a good time, right? They're drugs that you take to retreat and withdrawal. And interestingly, one of the main reasons why those drugs do end up very often killing people is because if there is a bad reaction, then there's no one with you. And so a big predictor of dying from drugs is being alone.
Johann Hari, I hope I'm saying that name correctly, said that the opposite of addiction is connection. I absolutely love that. That basically kind of confirms everything you've been saying. And so I want to use that as a bridge to a jumping off point, other than telling kids, not the Nancy Reagan, don't do drugs alone, but also what are some potential solutions? Should we be legalizing drugs, or is it more just programs to help young men feel more connected?
Yeah, so I'm going to confess to not being enough of an expert on drug policy to talk seriously about that side of it. But what I would say, I'm much more interested in the demand side and the conditions with which what would lead people to kind of take drugs, and then with whom and to what end, right? To what, this is back to the, I'm not here to endorse drug use, period. But I just think, like, if you're taking a relatively safe pill to try and stay up late at night, or you think you're taking some cocaine and you do that very occasionally, etc., that's very different to this drug of retreat, drug of despair, drug of loneliness stuff that we're seeing playing out. So to the extent that Johann's line is correct about, and I've heard him say that too, and I like it too, it's connection, then I think what we should be doing is pushing hard on where are the places that boys and men can connect. What are the social institutions? What are the places and spaces and institutions that promote, encourage, and support fraternity, right? It's really weird. It's interesting to me, reflecting on fraternities, is that the thing that I think that's probably most lacking in the lives of many young men, and middle-aged men, is fraternity. It's friendships, it's male friendships in particular. It's a sense of community and attachment and connection. So why we've allowed Boy Scouts to drop the boy, for example, so that it's no longer Boy Scouts. It's now Scouting for America and has gone kind of co-ed. But also, Scott, the decline in participation in sport in high school among boys. It's going up among girls. It's going down among boys. The lack of coaches, the disengagement from extracurricular activities, all that stuff. It's it actually takes quite a lot to build community, to build connection. And we have not done a good enough job of creating places and spaces and institutions where boys feel comfortable creating those relationships, which are back to where I started. I was blown away by the fact that these 17, 18-year-old boys are afraid of being lonely on college campuses. And it's less true for other groups, because those colleges are actually making a real point of saying there'll be affinity groups, there'll be a women's support group, there'll be a girls who code group, there'll be a whatever, very intentional, explicit attempts to create a sense of community among other groups. And I think we've made the mistake of thinking that men don't need that.
I saw some really interesting, or I talked to someone who was a family attorney, which is a way of saying he helps people get divorced. And he sent me some data saying that amongst gay men, marriages with gay men, 28% divorce rate. Straight couples, 48% divorce rate. Gay women, lesbian marriages, 72%. And I thought, wow, does this mean women bring more quote unquote divorce energy to the relationship? And that just sort of blew me away, because I'd never heard that before. And he said that he's had a lot of his clients commit suicide and, or die by suicide, I'm told is the right way to say it now.
Correct.
And he said something really rattling. He said that we all want to believe they're mentally ill and it's something outside of our control and outside of their control. We have empathy for them. They had no control over it. Or that it's not our fault to struggle with depression. And he said, I get it. He said, these guys basically do the math. They don't want to get divorced. Essentially, their divorce is usually presaged by some sort of financial stress, a bankruptcy, lose the business, some sort of emotional breakdown on the part of the man. His spouse decides she doesn't want to stay in the marriage. Family court is biased towards men. So, and you actually may have even talked about this. I apologize if I keep parroting back what I've learned from you, but in one fell swoop, within a matter of months or a small number of years, a guy loses his primary relationship, his children, his economic well-being, and he makes a very rational decision to kill himself. I wonder if at some point you come back on one of our pods and say drug poisonings, suicide and divorce. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so the suicide risk among men generally is 4 times higher than among women. If you narrow that scope to just divorced men and women, it is 8 times higher among divorced men than among divorced women. And so I think there's a general point here. I didn't know that data about divorce. It's also true that women initiate twice as many divorces. Women account for 2/3 of divorce initiations in the US now. So women are, just as an empirical matter, they're more likely to initiate divorce. And there's this interesting study recently, I think it was out of Sweden, which looked at what happens to men and women who win the lottery. The men who won the lottery became a bit more likely to get married and not to have children. The women who won the lottery were more likely to divorce their husband.
I love that.
I mean, I'm laughing in a sort of gallows humor way because, and of course, like a good feminist critique of that would be, well, the women have got more exit power and they're using it, right? And if it's economic dependency tying them to the guy, then hallelujah, she's free of that. And that's actually a great sort of microcosm of the whole push for more economic independence for women. And, you and I are both strong advocates of that being a wonderful thing. The issue then is what happens to men who get detached from institutions like family and marriage and therefore end up, as you say, feeling like they're not valued. And I probably said this to you before, but the 2 words that men use to describe themselves before they take their lives from suicide in notes and so on, the 2 most commonly used words are useless and worthless. And we just did another paper, this will be interesting to you, I think, where we looked at the differences between men with a college degree and those without, the paper on working class men. And one of the stats in there that really blew me away, and I think I know this stuff, and then I dig deeper and really get surprised, which is that men without a college degree between the ages of 30 and 50 are only about 50% of those men have a child in their household. It's basically 50-50 whether they've got kids in their household. For women without a college degree, it's still 80%. And for those men, it was 80%, north of 80%. And so we've got to a situation now where, like, particularly for kind of working class men, if I can use that definition of them, like 50-50 whether they have kids in their household. Now, they might have kids but not be in their household anymore. And I think one of the things we're learning is there was some truth to the conservative concern that if men became less economically important, if women became less economically reliant on men, that was going to leave a lot of men feeling beached and surplus to requirements. And their fear was those men would start acting out. We'd see massive rises in crime, all kinds of antisocial behavior. It'd be like Mad Max, right? As these men are kind of roaming around. And of course, the opposite's happened by and large. We've actually seen men retreating. They're checking out more than acting out. And I see suicide as in some ways the most tragic version of men just checking out, looking around and deciding that society, their family, their community, their church, their workplace really would be fine without them, maybe even better off without them. And if there is a greater human tragedy, then leading people to feel unneeded to that extent, then I don't know what it is.
Yeah, I was fascinated by that study on divorce, so I looked into it, and some additional data was that they believe that a lot of women, quote unquote, if you're going to say women have more divorce energy, which is disparaging towards women, you also have to acknowledge that as women have made more money, men shouldering domestic responsibilities has not kept pace with women's economic ascent, and that marriage has become a worse deal. And that is, a lot of women feel like, okay, I'm now making as much or more money, but I'm also taking care of the house. This is just a raw deal for me. I don't know if you thought about solutions, but this goes to a question around solutions is, if we know that a single point of failure for when a boy becomes much more likely to engage in self-harm, be incarcerated, become addicted, is when he loses a male role model. That is, mom and dad get divorced, and I think 92% of the time mom ends up with the kids. Shouldn't there be massive programs and immediate triggers that when there's a divorce, when there's a household divorce, it's just the next thing is we have got to figure out resources and programs to get men, to ensure men are involved in this boy's life moving forward. And two, when a man is divorced or when a couple gets divorced, that there needs to be some sort of education or program availability for these men post-divorce.
Yeah, the work of Catherine Eden and Tim Nelson on this, on particularly working with kind of lower income families, just basically they conclude by saying that the current child support system, family court system, especially for unmarried men, needs to be radically reformed. It needs to be reformed into a pro-family system and into a pro-fatherhood system. And right now, the way that the system works is that it basically splits men, fathers, into two halves. It says, on the one hand, where's the money? So it's the child support element to it. And then on the other hand, completely unrelated, do you want to see your kid? And the father, in every US state, the father has to prove paternity if the kid was born outside marriage. And it's a completely separate legal process to get access. And so I think moving to the presumption of equal access and equal custody is important. Of course, there are always going to be exceptions that people can point to. What's interesting about this is that in states that have tried to move to like an equal custody presumption, in other words, in law, you just presume, unless there's a good reason to the contrary, which there could be, that, mums and dads have the same rights. This weird alliance of lawyers and pretty strong feminist groups join forces to kill it. And the reason that the women's groups do it is because they're protecting women's position in the family, and they know, and access to child support. And the reason the lawyers do it is because they're going to lose half their business, right? If it just becomes a straightforward 50-50 split, then they don't have couples arguing with each other. Then they're going to lose like half their legal fees. And so I do agree that thinking about fatherhood, custody, access more in a more pro-dad way is huge. I just think we have failed to update our views about fatherhood. And by the way, fathers need to step up more in the way you just said. And so the legal system is still just antiquated. And especially it's antiquated given that, except for college-educated Americans, most kids aren't born inside marriage now. And so you can't just rely on divorce laws to do it. You've got to deal with the fact that, the preponderance of cases here, that the parents weren't married. The last thing I'll say on this is I actually had this guy in tears at an event where I gave all my charts showing how good dads are for kids, right? Their high school graduation rates, actually their chances of using drugs, or just how important dads are as role models. And this dad came up to me in tears afterwards and said, yeah, but also being a father is the most important thing in my life. And what I came to realize is that fatherhood isn't just a means to an end. Fatherhood is actually a central part of the identity, purpose, and meaning that a lot of men have in their lives.
It's really, what you say always resonates so much. I'm struggling with my 17-year-old is now at boarding school, and it was sold to me, and I'm going to act like the victim here as, I'll be home Friday afternoons and go back to school on Monday morning. No, he has school Saturday morning. He gets home for 24 hours. And I not only miss him, but what I've come to realize is that I like myself as a dad. I really do feel good about, I feel like on programs like this, I virtue signal and create this picture that I'm a better father than I actually am. But I know I'm a good dad. And I get a lot of confidence from it. And it gives me a certain level of, I don't know, my role. Like I check this box. I'm helping the species. And not 50% of my ability to act in what I think is a nice role is gone because he's no longer here during the week. And it has really fucked with me. It has hurt my self-esteem. I feel anchorless. I just wonder if there's programs. I'm even thinking I am dreading, Richard. I don't know if you feel about this. I know you have kids. I am so freaked out about the moment my second leaves for college. They talk about women go through this. My partner, she's going to be fine. She's she's already kind of counting the days till they're out of the house because I think she gets she gets more work and less fun than I do. But it just strikes me so much how that role of fatherhood, it's not only, something I enjoy, it's just so central to my identity. And I can't imagine what it must be like I think in family court, you lose your kids, you lose access. Mom, at least when my parents got divorced, did your parents stay together, Richard?
Yeah, mine did. Yeah. Still are together.
That's wonderful. What happens, or at least happened with me, and I saw it happen with most of my friends, is that a kid can't process the agita or the dissent or the problem of these two people splitting up. It makes no sense. So immediately they go, oh, someone must be a bad person. And it's unlikely that the bad person is the person you're living with making you breakfast every morning. It's the bad person is the one who's left, whether he or she wanted custody. And so I just think there's a very easy tendency for kids of divorced parents to kind of demonize dad. And that's what I did. I'm like, mom's a saint, dad's awful. I'm fascinated by this notion of what you said was really striking, that men are 4 times more likely to die of suicide, but become 8 times more likely to recently divorce. Are there programs or any more data that you've talked about in terms of what happens with men after they lose their primary relationship and no longer live with their kids?
Yeah, there's data. I mean, I've given you the suicide one, but just their life expectancy goes down. Their chances of earning, being employed, goes down. Other health conditions worsen. And sometimes that's a bit of an eye roll moment. It's like, well, of course, if men don't have women to look after them and remind him to take his pills and go to the doctor, then, he's hopeless, isn't he? There's a sort of sense of that, bit of an eye roll around it. But I think a deeper understanding that's closer to what you were talking about, which is that sense of connection and purpose and meaning and neededness, right? The sense of being needed versus surplus to requirements, I think is really the axis I try to think about this along. Now, it's very interesting to me that men now are more likely to say that having kids and getting married is important for a satisfying life than women are, right? So the old trope about it's women that want to get married and have kids and men who have to be dragged into it, the ball and chain, and the men would rather be off like a cowboy just doing their own thing, but they get ensnared into domestic life. But deep down, they want to be out on the range or doing their own thing, and that is bullshit. It is absolutely the opposite of the truth. Is that actually men? What makes you a man is what you're doing for others. We both talk about this, the kind of connection to others, but also generating a surplus, being generative, this idea of generative masculinity. And actually listening to you now is a spark of the thought that one of the things we know from the work of Anna Machin and other people, she's a great scholar on fatherhood, by the way. If you don't know her stuff, she has this wonderful book called The Life of Dad, which is basically about how we invented fatherhood in humanity. But actually dads really come into their own in the adolescent years. Right, mums seem to have a bit of a competitive advantage in the early years, and dads have a competitive advantage in those adolescent years because you're helping your kids go out into the world, to grow, to develop, to take risks appropriately, develop social skills. In other words, the simpler way to putting this is that mums are really good when the kids are in the nest, and dads are really good at helping prepare them to leave the nest. But actually, when they then leave the nest, you've just lost the thing that you were doing over the previous few years. And so in a weird way, I think for dads, their kids leaving at 18 is much more of a loss than for mums, because mums have sort of done more of their work, if you like, emotionally anyway, like when the kids were 8, right? Whereas dads come into their own in these later years, only to see them kind of fly away. And a lot of dads, I certainly feel this, is this mixture of pride and loss.
We'll be right back. On the Diary of a CEO, you said that we're in the relatively early stages of a cultural revolution, one where the economic relation between men and women has dramatically transformed. Say more?
Yeah, so with 1979, 13% of women earned more than the median man, like a typical man, 13%. Last time I looked, it was 40% of women earned more than the typical man. 40% of breadwinners are male in the US, female rather, in the US now. So in the space of my lifetime, I'm in my mid-50s, born in 69, In the space of my lifetime, we have utterly transformed the relative economic position of men and women in advanced economies, including in the US. Now, we haven't achieved full equality, and obviously there's still some work to be done, but the level of economic independence that women have achieved in the matter of decades has been just gigantic and hugely liberating, wonderful, etc. But I genuinely think that it takes time for cultures to adjust to such massive economic changes. I mean, that is a fundamental change in the economic relationship between kind of men and women. And what it's done is it's unbundled the traditional ways in which men and women were kind of tied to each other economically. And I do think this comes back to our earlier conversation. I really think that we were focused on the economic dependence of women on men in traditional marriage and tried to reduce that. But I don't think we paid quite enough attention to the emotional dependence of men on those families, on those marriages, and on the kind of being the co-residents kind of with their kids. And what's happened is that as women have become more economically independent, the degree to which men were actually quite emotionally dependent on those traditional structures has become glaringly apparent. And the gap has really opened up. And I think that's the chasm that I see a lot of men really struggling to cross or fall into. And so culturally, that's a gigantic shift, and it's good. It's good. But the thing I find frustrating about this is people's inability to say you can have this really great change, like the rise of women's economic independence and choice, and to say, but by the way, there's going to be some bumps in the road here because we've just radically transformed the way in which kind of men feel their place in society. And you don't have to end up being reactionary and saying, oh, that's why we should go back, which is what some of the reactionary right-wingers are saying, which is like, that's why we need to go back, right? No, we need to go forward. But we have to go forward with some empathy and compassion for the fact that this is a very different world that men are navigating now.
You've touched on the idea of a new script for masculinity and the new set of roles and the new set of dues. What do you mean, and what does the script look like?
Yeah, so I'm always a bit reluctant around this because, of course, there are lots of different scripts. But, I mean, it comes back a bit to fatherhood. I now place a lot of weight, increasingly actually as I'm doing the work, on the importance of fatherhood as that anchoring. I'm using the way you just describe your own relationship with your son, like the anchor, you feel anchored by it, as an anchor for men. And being a provider and a protector in a way that is appropriate for the kind of modern world. So I've come to believe that we have to retain these ideals, these ideas about the role of men, but just update them. So rather than saying, okay, we don't need protectors, we don't need providers, we don't, instead I think we need to say that you can provide and protect in different ways now. So I think actually, for example, and your colleague Jonathan Haidt, and our mutual friend, is doing a lot of work right now on how do you protect kids from some of the online environments that they kind of might be. Like, how do you step in between some of the forces out there in the world and your kids' well-being, right? That's being a protector. You don't have to be throwing a punch every time. And I would say the same way being a provider doesn't necessarily mean that your dollar, the dollar amount on your monthly paycheck, has to be a certain level or has to be a certain level more than your wife's or your partner's. But by God, it means you need to be providing to your household time, energy, skills, etc. Right? You don't have to be providing in just this very narrow economic way, but by God, you have to provide, right? So I said this before, but like as a stay-at-home dad, I felt like a provider, right? Because I was providing the space and energy for my wife to be able to work, not knowing her kids were in safe hands. I think actually for a lot of women, knowing that their kids are in their father's care while they're working, that's hugely powerful.
I love this notion, and we'll wrap up here because I just think it's such a great construct for young men, or a great framework. Talk about the notion of surplus value.
So when you look through the history of like what turns a boy into a man in most human societies, it is some mark of them producing more of something than they need for themselves. Now, in a kind of post-war economy with more money, that's the breadwinner version of it. But that wasn't true 5,000 years ago on the savannah. That was meat. That was protein for the tribe and for the mother of your child. In other places, it could be something else. But I think that I love this idea of masculinity, mature masculinity, being defined in terms of giving more than you get. It's a service-oriented form of masculinity. It's definitely the one I got from my father's knee. I mean, just absolutely the kind of giving more than you get. And that's why there's this movement online of men going their own way, like a men's separatist movement saying, we don't need women, we don't need marriage, we don't need kids, we don't need the labor market, screw you, we're off. That is literally the opposite of masculinity. The idea of masculinity is surplus generator, is I know you're a man when you're generating more energy, time, love, money, meat, whatever the hell it is, than you need for your own survival. Because that is historically what men have had to do, is to contribute to the family, to the tribe, to the community. And if you're not a contributor in all these different ways, then you ain't a man. And so if you're wondering how to be a man, start by doing something for somebody else, and that will lead you in the right direction.
Richard Reeves is the president of the American Institute for Boys and Men, which he founded in 2023 to raise awareness of the problems of boys and men and advocate for effective solutions. He's also a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C., where he previously directed the Future of the Middle Class Initiative and the Center on Children and Families. His 2022 book of Boys and Men, Why the Modern Male is Struggling, Why It Matters and What to Do About It, was described as a landmark in the New York Times and named a Book of the Year by both The Economist and The New Yorker. And distinctive his accent, he joins us from Eastern Tennessee. Did I get that right, Richard?
Correct. Yeah. Southern Appalachia. Yeah.
I would bet you're one of the more interesting people in that area, and that's a disparaging statement about Eastern Tennessee, but I bet people are fascinated with you as we are. And Richard, I say this, but it bears repeating. You have literally inspired me to take this on as an issue. Thank you so much for your good work.
Thank you for your work, Scott. Always a pleasure.